When humanity is left to stagnate, it does not simply die. It is often found to swell, mutate, corrupt, and then it crawls back up through the mud as something else and something similar, both at once. The abyss and its later incarnation, the deep, is the most obvious case of this, with lost 𝙬𝙗𝙬 following second. Manos's drive to madness forced the world to rapidly evolve, and what ended up at the finish line was the pollution of the dark soul. But why? Why does the primordial darkness of the primordial sorcerer deteriorate into this specific form? In the Japanese religion Shinto, there is a concept called 𝙘𝙤𝙢𝙢, in where your soul enters a state of defilement, and the nature of kami, the natural world and everything within it, is used to either cleanse or coexist alongside 𝙘𝙤𝙢. Kami is a little complicated to explain, as they are spirits and also deities, but also everything from the geographical terrain to the weather that happens every single day. And it seems that these concepts within Shintoism seem to reflect inside the franchise as both the abyss and something that is no longer the abyss. To understand the forms that the abyss takes, we actually have to first understand what the abyss is. Manos, a primordial human, lived as a sorcerer, manipulating humanity into magic, and then he died. After his death, 𝙗 arrived in 𝙗𝙗𝙢, demanding a new lord for New Londo, and when he learnt of Manos, 𝙗 manipulated the citizens of 𝙗𝙗𝙢 into believing that it was necessary to resurrect the sorcerer, and so they followed his command. However, when Manos awoke, he found his pendant missing, and was quickly driven to a state of pure frenzy that would devour 𝙗𝙗𝙢 and the royal wood surrounding it. It was the decline of humanity that rebirthed Manos into the Lord of the Abyss, and with this understanding in mind, I subjectively think that the Abyss, then, is not an external force. It is humanity itself, unshackled and rampant in what might just be its purest, most natural form. One of these frenzied mutations ended up as a bloat-headed sorcerer, but interestingly, the item description of its head states, "The head of an 𝙗𝙗𝙢 resident whose humanity went wild after being devoured by the dark of Manos, father of the abyss." Isn't that curious? Not possessed nor cursed, but instead devoured. And from the feast, what was regurgitated was a physically larger, weightier beast. The dark soul inside gets bloated to unbearable sizes, forcing too many eyes to manifest in this odd attempt to keep up with the bloating, which forces the victim to go naturally insane with this newfound insight, so to speak, that they have gained. And then there is the aforementioned New Londo. The four kings, once human leaders, were seduced by 𝙗, again, into embracing the dark, and as such, their bodies also mutated, and mutated profoundly. They became these tree-like beings with bark-like wooden membranes spreading out chaotically from their hearts, which had prior embraced the dark, and root-like horns extended from their heads in what one might think to be nature trying to stake claim on a new place, in the same way that nature always takes back what is stolen from it. Shintoism 𝙘𝙤𝙢 is the Japanese term for a state of pollution and defilement, as you might have already guessed. But if you don't know, typical causes of 𝙘𝙤𝙢 are contact with any form of death, childbirth, disease, and even something like menstruation. 𝙘𝙤𝙢 manifests when any dirty act happens, no matter how benign, and crucially, it is not a moral judgment, nor does it equate to a Christian or Catholic sin, as 𝙘𝙤𝙢 is a spontaneous reaction to natural forces. Whether the defiling was caused by a deliberate act or an external event is entirely secondary. In other words, it boils down to being about contact with something that disrupts the natural order, but is arguably natural within itself. I was actually partially inspired to make this video from this article on Medium by 𝙄𝙎𝙎𝙖𝙀𝙙, I'm gonna say. I probably pronounced that wrong, I'm very sorry. And this journalist goes into great depth about stagnation in Dark Souls, and I'll leave it linked in the description if any of you would like to read it. It's very good. Anyway, in Shinto, the term yodomi, stagnation, describes something unmoving whose flow has been interrupted, and 𝙄𝙎𝙎𝙖𝙀𝙎, I'm gonna say it again in hopes that I'm saying it right, but I probably am not. They write, in Shinto, this assumes a religious connotation. What's affected by stagnation is by definition stationary, and this state of immobility naturally leads to rot. They also note Japanese sensibility translates this to the human condition, and that stagnant pools are a natural seedbed for filthy creatures, from insects to mollusks and other invertebrates. However, we also need to understand kami, which I briefly mentioned earlier, to fully grasp this picture of many fancy words. Kami are not like the omnipotent gods of Western traditions, nor are they like the ones depicted within the Dark Souls franchise, as they aren't omnipotent and not inherently different in kind from human beings or nature, as they are simply a higher manifestation of life's energy. Kami can be spirits that inhabit living beings, or they can be the beings themselves. But also within Shinto, the land, its nature, and all of the creatures, including humans, are children of kami. But again, all things existing on this earth have the possibility of becoming kami, a circle of life in a way. So since all and everything are manifestations of the same life force, that means all of it can be corrupted by 𝙘𝙤𝙢. And when 𝙘𝙤𝙢 enters a kami, it does not destroy it, but instead transforms it and stagnates it. And from that stagnation emerge creatures that are not evil in a moral sense, but are impure and often animalistic. Very importantly, these byproducts are the natural result of a natural force being blocked, pulled, and left to rot again. And absolutely, this is exactly what happens to 𝙗𝙗𝙖𝙗𝙗 humanity in Dark Souls. Humanity is a fragment of the Dark Soul, a natural being. But when it is tortured or allowed to stagnate, as with Manus and 𝙗𝙗𝙖𝙗, or even 𝙙𝙬𝙖𝙗 and �gwendolyn, it does not simply vanish. It ends up becoming 𝙘𝙤𝙢, a dirty thing, and it is from that pool where beasts and bugs and the deep is allowed to embolden. Although when it comes to the deep, I will be very honest in saying I still don't quite fully understand it as well as I do the abyss. At least I think I understand the abyss well, so I may get some things wrong, but hopefully not misconstrued it when it comes to the deep. As I subjectively understand it, the deep is both the abyss and not the abyss, but it also exists within the abyss, I guess. The deep, which was founded in Dark Souls 3, but was present from the start apparently, is a corrupted and unnatural version of the abyss. Instead of being the result of frenzy, it is the product of an immense mass of accumulated and stagnated human dregs. And human dregs are the densest and heaviest parts of the Dark Soul that have stewed and boiled flame after flame, and they physically exist and they are physically heavy, and so they sink and they keep sinking, and then the deep appears. So while the abyss is a place completely blanketed in darkness and quiet, the deep, however, appears murky and damp and more similar to a marsh. The Deep Protection Miracle states, the deep was originally a peaceful and sacred place, but became the final rest for many abhorrent things. The Cathedral of the Deep was built to purify worshippers through its holy spring, but 𝙿𝙬𝙖𝙗, a cleric who devoured men until he became this melted sludge, was exiled there, and his accumulated darkness from the cannibalism fermented and degenerated into dark dregs, a darkness beyond any natural limit, which which resulted in the cathedral's sacred water becoming infected, accumulating and stagnating filth until it became an ecosystem for maggots and insects that infested the corpses buried at the cathedral. However, unlike the real world, the maggots and other insects in question had been transformed by 𝙁𝙬𝙎 in a similar way to Manus's madness. These bugs possessed bug-sized jaws lined front to back with teeth used to tear and eat flesh in seconds, which was perhaps an evolution stemmed directly from 𝙁𝙬𝙎's cannibalism. Then there are the corpse grubs, who evolved from those very same maggots found in the waterways of the cathedral. Assumedly, the maggots infested the skeletons buried in the graveyard and strung together sludge to use as a glue-like substance to puppeteer the corpses around the now defiled waterways, aimlessly dragging themselves around with no real goal. And the merkmen found in the DLC of Dark Souls 3, their very name comes from merk, derived from Old Norse, mörker, meaning darkness, but they evoke the very feeling of dark water. They are literally damp men born in the deep, and they dwell in the deep. The abyss that stemmed from Manus was a wild, explosive force, and so naturally it produced bloated heads that created chaos within the victims, but it also manifested physical humanity phantoms that became sentient and spread throughout the chasm that imprisoned Manus in what might have been him desperate to find the pendant, to the point that he shed parts of himself when he himself was too large to leave. A frantic byproduct one could only connect to madness, I guess. The deep, however, is the abyss if it has stagnated instead of exploded. It is the deepest part of the dark soul that has sunk and fermented, as I previously said, which creates an insect-breeding miasma because it is literally a swamp of grossness, but also allows those creatures to thrive in an environment strictly curated for them. Off the top of my head, I would compare it to a compost bin. You know, kind of gross to humans, but actually really beneficial to literally everything else in the ecosystem. All in all, I think you can view the deep as the abyss after it has undergone 𝙤𝙤𝙢𝙎, after the abyss itself became a natural state from the long-ignored 𝙤𝙤𝙎𝙎. The abyss does not kill anyone, nor does the deep. It changes you until you can only beg for death. In other words, it stagnates you, and in that stagnation you become part of the natural world again, but the filthiest, grossest parts. You become the bears, the beetles, the beaten up buildings, or something that slithers in the deep of night. Until next time, praise the sun, and cleanse the bastard's curse if you have the time, otherwise they might just end up as a slug.
Don't you dare let yourself go hollow, lest my time spent on you be wasted.